G'day guys. This one is going to be on endotoxins, lipopolysaccharides. So let's get into it. So we can get a bit of an overview. The impact of endotoxins on the human body. This was put together, so it's a post back in 2014. So endotoxin is a form of sugar. It's a structure composed of lipids and sugar complex. This structure is called lipopolysaccharide or LPS. You've probably heard people like Grundy and others talk about lipopolysaccharides, how bad they are, But the thing is, they've got no solution with their vagunarized approach. At the end of the day, what lipopolysaccharides are is the little hairline, this little lengthy thing, and what it does is it actually creates a negative charge around the actual bacteria themselves. So it has a useful place. Obviously, if you've got basically leaky gut or stuff like that, or damage or stuff like that, you could potentially get this sort of stuff in your bloodstream, which is not a good thing. It can cause endotoxemia. So, and in severe cases, sepsis and stuff like that, really severe sort of states, which can be dangerous. Anyway, this structure is necessary component of gram-negative bacteria to maintain cell wall integrity. Yes, we know. I've just explained about the negative charge. It is a major component of their cell wall and is important for their survival. The classification of bacteria as gram-negative or gram-positive is based on the microscopic strain method called gram staining. Two dyes are applied. The first dye is blue or violet. It is followed by decolorization, and then the second dye, which is red. The bacteria that retain the color of the first dye are called gram-positive. The bacteria that lose the color of the first dye but retain the color of the second dye are then called gram-negative. So you learn something about bacteria. The LPS is also called an endotoxin because it is a toxin located inside the bacterial cell, which originally theorized that endotoxin is released once the bacteria die. Well, yes, but LPS can also be shed. It can be shed in a cell. It is now, I know in fact, the bacteria release small amounts. Oh, okay, they're actually saying that of endotoxin as part of their normal metabolism, so the majority is still retained inside the cell. It's a shedding thing. That's all it is. I have a theory that basically, because it's actually putting this negative charge and all that, there's probably because of maybe a sort of an electrostatic effect that you get this shedding of material from the tip. Anyway, it's a theory. It's a hypothesis of mine. It is now a known fact that bacteria release more. Yep. LPS is structurally divided into three parts: O antigen, a core oligosaccharide, and lipid A. The outermost structure is the O antigen. Is also called an antigen because it is the target for recognition for the host or human immune response. The O antigen is a receptive sequence of glycans. As I said, like our cells have little glycans, these sugar ends. This sequence is variable and produces different types of O antigens, and there are 160 known types of bacterial. E. coli alone, biological difference of these contribute to overall variability in the tests of LAL. Anyway, the core domain simply contains multiple sugars, chains, as well as non-carbohydrate components. While the lipid A molecule is a variable component of LPS, its anchor, LPS, is the cell wall. Once the cell wall is degraded, lipid A is released from the bacterial cell and its component responsible for the toxic effects of LPS in the human body. So it depends on how much bacteria gets into your bloodstream, how toxic the levels will get to in terms of inflammation, which will activate macrophage and the immune response and all that sort of stuff. So we'll read that part here. Once inside the body, natural defense cells like macrophage and monocyte recognize a bacteria as foreign. This recognition process is mediated by antigens in bacteria, which induce O antigen of LPS. Bacteria may sometimes evade destruction, but are normally degraded by our defense cells. The endotoxins located within the bacteria are then released into the circulation and exert this deleterious effect. So basically, when our immune system attacks them, then you get this endotoxin sort of stuff that gets released. The defense cell in our body also releases substances that may stimulate pathways that compound the negative effects of endotoxin, sort of unregulated immune responses can be a problem even because due to viruses, not only to bacterial as well. So a well-regulated immune system, and we know what does that. Your vitamin D and your dear friend taurine as well as your first line of defense, which is the best defense, and that's T lymphocytes. Anyway, let's move on. Component cascades through substances C3A and C5A cause the release of histamine, a major effect for the allergic response component. Cascade generate, causing vacillation and inflammation. So vasodilation and inflammation is part of the effect. Remember, also causes histamine release. Sometimes some of these pathogenic bacteria that build up in our body, sometimes when we've got issues with our gut integrity. This is why I say vitamin D and taurine play a very big role in this area. So a steak and the sun can be very beneficial in that regard. Inflammation response is mediated through the release of substances that include the cytokine, interleukins, prostaglandins, and tumor necrosis factor. Interleukins are pyrogenic. They cause febrile response. Aside from the inflammation, these substances also mediate the shock response, your heat shock proteins. Anyway, coagulation pathway is also activated. Basically clotting factors, blah, blah, blah. There's generally aggregation of platelet aggregation. Grounding is really good to reduce platelet aggregation, and also good pericellular, which is having good levels of sulfur in your diet as well, which taurine. Dilatation of the blood vessels and increased leakage of the vessel walls, which is not a good thing in that regard. But animal foods do help in that regard as well. These substrates require a form of blood. Clot may be diminished or depleted in endotoxemia. This depletion, along with the vessel dilatation and increased leakage, contributes to the occurrence of hemorrhages in bacterial infections. Bacteria with endotoxins. So this will go through. I'm not going to read this part. These are all the species. So people can read, cholera, blah, 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 E. coli, different strains. This one was actually found in Germany in 2011, and it actually causes cigatoxins, also known as toxin. Bacterium causes dysentery, Shigella dysentery. The symptoms include diarrhea that may become bloody, abdominal pain, and bloody urine. So this is a pretty nasty one. Anyway, solutions: taurine blunts LPS induced increases in intracellular calcium and tumor necrosis factor A production in Kupffer cells. The abstract: activation of Kupffer cells by lipopolysaccharides plays a pivotal role on the onset of pathophysiological events that occur during endotoxemia, and intracellular calcium, yes, is involved in LPS stimulated cytokine production. That's another reason why calcium, at the normal physiological regulated homeostatic level, which is what taurine does, perfect. Once it gets out of that boundary, and usually whatever pathology happens, you get this increase in calcium sort of situation. It's not so derangements as well. Recently have shown that Kupffer cell contain a glycine-related chloride channel. Because taurine, a ubiquitous sulfur-containing B amino acid, acts similarly to glycine. Remember, methionine, glycine, and basically taurine in terms of synthesis. So obviously there are relationships here. Acts similar to glycine in neurons by causing hyperpolarization. It is also a hypothesis that taurine would act via a similar mechanism, blunting LPS-induced increases in calcium. And we know from the other one that I actually did that basically covering about beta cells and stuff like that. Remember, I talked about the blunting effect of, and also the homeostatic regulatory effect of calcium. So blunts the LPS induced increase. So because LPS does increase calcium concentrations. To test this hypothesis, a couple of cells were isolated from female rats and cultured for 24 hours. LPS-induced changes in calcium were monitored fluorometrically in single cells where levels of tumor necrosis factor, we've covered tumor necrosis factor and the importance of taurine as well on that one, released by a couple of cells after exposed to LPS. So we're exposing these cells lines to LPS. We see tumor necrosis factor A going up. Were measured by enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay. Taurine significantly blunted LPS-induced increases in calcium in a dose-dependent manner. So we actually saw increasing the dose, reducing the dose, you've got a dose-dependent. That's a very good relationship. When things are all over the place, or things are associated to some extent, you really need a dose dependent. It's a bit like, the other studies where if you increase something, things get worse, you reduce it, things get better. That's a dose dependent. It fulfills the Bradford Hill criteria in many respects. Anyway, this effect was reversed by sterning, which was prevented when chloride was removed from extracellular media. So they're playing around with all these other substances to see whether they can affect it in a different way with certain substances. That substance is sort of a toxic substance which they use to kill rats as well. So I forget there's a brand, a well-known brand, but I just can't remember it. Moreover, taurine increases intracellular uptake cells in a dose-dependent manner. Furthermore, reverses the effects. That one can actually reverse the effects of taurine. So you can actually see these things, how they can actually have an effect when you use these medication or these chemical substances. These results indicate that taurine activates a glycine gate chloride channel in capillary cells, causing chloride influx. In addition, LPS-induced human necrosis production was reduced by more than 40% by taurine, an effect that was also reversed by that other substance as well. In conclusion, taurine blocks the increase of calcium due to LPS, significantly reduces human necrosis production by mechanisms involving chloride influx into the cells, into that cell line of that rat. So I'm not going to go through it all. People can actually look at this, and see the sort of differences in terms of the control and bring it, in terms of LPS and stuff like that, and adjusting. Effects of that other stuff they put in there. Tumor necrosis factor, so taking more and reducing it further. At a certain point, there's not as that. These authors acknowledge the help of some of these others. It is interesting to note that it's been proposed recently that taurine could be used as a prophylactic or pre-operative therapeutic approach to manage phagocyte-mediated events by preventing the increase of calcium due to LPS. Taurine reduces the production of TNF in cells. Thus, taurine could present a new strategy to reduce liver injury due to production of toxic mediated by LPS activated Kupffer cells in sepsis, trauma, and alcohol liver injury. Well, you've heard me before. Let's say if you've been on the terps with the boys, had a bit too much to drink, you know that I usually take not only the B vitamins, but taurine right after as well. That's the reason why I do. And also choline to export the fat out and a few things like that, my little cheats, which recently I've sort of avoided. I've only had one or two indiscretions in that department. I'm aware what it does in that regard, but I'm still human, and I do live in a hostile food environment like the rest of you. As long as we can keep away from most of that stuff as much as possible, that's the key thing. But the take-home message is it will reduce the effects of LPS in the system, which can be very damaging. And by boosting also, let me just get rid of that, by boosting your vitamin D levels and your taurine levels, you're going to improve your T lymphocytes, which they also play a role in cleaning up all this sort of stuff. The general immune system, macrophage, and all the others tend to basically clear up all this sort of stuff. So one, it's inhibiting. Two, it's reducing those inflammatory pathways. It's regulating the calcium, which is important, which actually reduces the effect of that, and then a well-regulated immune system without inducing too much damage to the cell, to the body. It can go and slowly clean up all the mess and remove it. The key thing is, if you're not eating garbage, if you're not doing damage to the, to the gut wall, you're going to have less susceptibility of this. But as a good therapeutic for sepsis, so if you do get this problem, sepsis, trauma, alcohol injury, these sort of things, LPS levels in there, taurine is has shown to really be a very effective solution. All these guys out there in the veganerized world will, like your number of them that talk about LPS and stuff like that, they don't really have solutions. They talk about it. They go, oh, this causes that or whatever. And they actually use reductionist science to basically claim that fats and stuff like that have a role. Absolutely nonsense. Just because basically, I mean, the LPS is actually made of sugar molecules and fat. So be it. But basically, that's part of the structure of this bacterium. It means nothing about what we eat has any relevance in that regard. On the opposite, a carnivore diet which furnishes far more taurine is going to be way better at dealing with these problems compared to a veganerized diet, very poor in taurine in comparison. So I'd say to Gundry, you may have identified the problem in terms of things like LPS, as he calls them, little pieces of shit, is his nickname that he uses for them, but he has no solution like a lot of the other vagoons out there. They have no real solution. We do. It's called a steak. It's called seafood, things that are high in taurine that basically can do the trick. Now, obviously, for other people out there on the veganerized spectrum or the sad diet world, a few grams of taurine probably would be very helpful to try and keep down some of these issues that they tend to be more exposed to nowadays. Anyway, that's about it. See yous.